for this?
I am ready for this.
Great.
I don't know how you feel, but I really enjoyed reading the two stories.
Being able to read the stories before adds like a whole new layer of my ability to really understand where the student is coming from in terms of their literary analysis.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I feel like I'm better prepared and my questions will be a little more analytical than they and more text specific than they have been in the past.
PBATs for me are more discussion and dialogue. And so based on what they say, based on what their interests might be, based on where they think that they could have like improved or were challenged, that usually prompts me with like what questions that I might ask.
The student elected not to really compare the two texts, which I thought was interesting. I don't know how much that was a choice. Do you feel like it's fair game for us to explore in real time how the two texts compare? Because I think they're fascinating.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I have some comparison questions.
Okay, great. So maybe in the end, when we do kind of glows and grows, we could push a little bit on being freer, not just getting caught in one lens, and being a little more fluid and thinking about that. Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a good conversation.
I agree.
This is the title of my PBAT. It's a trap, how the patriarchy seduces and abuses, an analysis of picking worms and pears. Two stories by Subankam Thamavongsa. My thesis is stating that women are often discriminated against in the workplace. They are often seduced by the power that bosses often offer. And
if you think about the presentation in terms of how it compared to the written work, the dialogue and the oral conversation allows you to really push and go deeper into some of the literary analysis.
I know you spoke a bit about almost a sense of responsibility as a male writing about this particular topic, but could you speak to us a little bit more about how you approach and how you got to your thesis?
Paris was the first story I read within this like collection of short stories. And so I just enjoyed the story. So I was like, okay, let me write about this. The sort of gender feminism lens, we were doing a unit on that. There's a very clear thread between picking worms and that story, you know? So that was sort of how I chose the stories. And like with those stories, it's like, that's a way I could go. There's a lot of evidence for that. There's clear proof for that.
In your presentation, you talked about how you really liked that line that where you compared like male entitlement to Santa's bag of gifts. Can you talk a little bit more about like why you really like that line that you crafted?
Well,
I like that line too, by the way.
thank you. I felt that like, I don't know, it was very easy to understand, right? Like even from a very visual sense, it's not like carrying some emotional baggage. It's like he's quite literally carrying a huge sack, and then to sort of carry that over, then that creates like a visual almost for the entitlement that a lot of men carry.
And I wondered what you thought about not so much of the worm text, but actually of Paris. Did you make any connections between the actual title of the short story and then what happens in the text?
It's a romantic place, right? It has that sense, and so then it's sort of ironic that like Tommy's cheating on his wife in this like place of romance. Paris is sort of like a very inherently sort of feminine place to me. I could probably delve into that a lot deeper, but it just sort of is, for me at least. And so to then sort of like have that contrasting with like this idea that, you know, even in this maybe feminine place, you know, women are still getting abused. And I thought that was sort of interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting that if I read it correctly, like Paris was kind of held up as the reward for Nicole playing the game with Tom.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually do want to go back to this sort of character analysis a little bit more. I want to hear your thoughts about James. Because in your paper you talk about James almost being an accidental man in the sense that he does things and he's not really quite conscious or sure of like what he's doing, why he's doing it. I'm really drawn to the scene at the end with James when he comes to the door to ask the young woman and he cries. And I want to know what your thoughts are on that. I mean, are all men like this? Do they all have the potential to sort of be part of this patriarchy in one way? Is there any redeeming quality to the men in the text? If so, who are they and what do you make of James in particular?
Well, I think James is a kid. You know, like he is 14 years old. He has so much life ahead of him. He totally could change. You know, he doesn't know what he's doing and that he's happening into these circumstances. The flip side to that coin is because he's sort of not actively doing this, because he doesn't have this knowledge of what he's doing, that also means that he thinks he's not doing anything wrong, right? From James' perspective, he's like, okay, I got this job, I've been doing great at it, I've been filling all my quotas, and then all of a sudden I'm going to this girl who I like, and you know, I asked her out for prom and she said yes. But all of a sudden I'm going there and, you know, she's all of a sudden turning me down. It's like, you know, he's 14, sure, he would cry about that, maybe his first rejection. It's sort of still up to him to like awaken.
I want to go back to like a particular scene that I think we talked about a little bit. I want to know your opinion on what happens to the two women at the end of the text. They're both crying.
Yeah.
And the author leaves it pretty open and says that they're crying for different reasons.
Yeah.
Why are they crying?
So Nicole is crying for a much more obvious reason, right? Her husband is cheating on her. And I think Red is sort of crying in sort of an empathetic way. And also perhaps in a thing of like, this is a moment where she's recognizing maybe all the trauma that's happened to her and being like, wow, so many things in my life are just a little messed up because I'm a woman. She's crying because she knows in order to have that cushier job, she'd have to betray this woman who is like crying on her arms and maybe like she doesn't want to do that. I think there's also a little bit of awakening moment for her. Maybe before she could ignore what was happening with like the front office and people having sex with Tommy and whatever, but this is in her face. This is forcing her to recognize what is happening.
I wanted to ask a question about, so in each story, cars play a really important role. Paris opens up with the truck. And in Picking Worms, there's this beautiful scene around when they drive to the worm farm at 1 a.m. What do you think the symbolism of the cars in these two stories really, what might it mean?
I think cars are sort of inherently intimate spaces. They force people to be very close together. And so I think that in Paris' case, it's like very obvious where it's like Tommy's having sex in cars. You know, it's very obviously an intimate space. I think that in Picking Worms, it's the first time we see James and the daughter in an enclosed space. I think it sort of is a way for the author to put people together, to put people in very close proximity.
I wondered, as we move to just kind of a more open conversation, if you had any questions for us about the text that you've been and we've had the privilege of reading these texts, so I wondered if there are things that you're like, wow, I wonder why the author chose to do this, or there's this thing, like.
Sometimes I do wonder why she chose to write the daughter as rejecting James. Because there's something to be said where she could have written it as a thing of like, she sort of goes to prom, James accepts that seduction, accepts whatever power comes with it. But, you know, she chose to have the daughter reject him. And there's the other thing where the mother sort of rejects James initially, right? She kind of hates him. Is it the daughter following the mother's footsteps? Is the mother doing that a sign of like whatever maturity she's got? And then a daughter doing that is also supposed to indicate, you know, maturity.
I think that the mother's reaction to James is the most dialogue that we get in the text. And it's biting, hard dialogue. And I think it's hard for a daughter to reject that.
You feeling like, I feel like we've got a really good sense of how your mind is working in this construct, which I super appreciate. You've been really super clear and detailed.
Yeah, thank you for that.
All right.
They had very good questions that, you know, really made me think deeper about the topic. I would sort of respond, and then they would then be like, okay, well then what about this? And so they sort of forced me to like take my initial response and then push it further.
So that clearly showed his conviction, his understanding, and his actually ability and desire to kind of push himself a little bit further in his thinking. That's the beautiful thing when that happens.